Hey, thanks for watching and giving me this time to encourage you and to help you thrive no matter where you find yourself. One of the things that I've been giving a lot of thoughts to lately, as I have listened to people and as I've read Facebook and social media feeds, is the way that people are handling this lockdown. And I think one of the things that, as I've read and as I've listened, that it's exposed to me at any rate, is that I think so many people have confused endurance with resilience. So many people are struggling in a sense that, with themselves and their attitudes and behaviors and this sense of confinement. And it's just beginning to get on top of them. And their response has been to just double down and I've just got to see this through. I'll just keep on doing what I'm doing. And once it's over, I'll just burst my bubble as quickly as possible and just pick up life where I left off. Or some people, it's just been a sense of just sheer being overwhelmed almost, and it's like metaphorically pulling the blankets up over their head and just waiting for morning to come, where they can just get out and just pick their life back up again. And I understand that, I really do, but I think there's a better way of processing things, and that's called resilience. It's resilience is the ability to adapt to change. It's the ability to adapt to our circumstances in constructive and positive ways. Because the reality is, in your life and mine, there will always be things that come into our life that are totally beyond us. Things like this lockdown, for example, but tragedies and trauma and disappointments and frustrations and all of those sorts of things that are beyond us and yet come into our lives. Resilience is the ability to adapt to those in ways that help us not just endure, but help us come out from underneath them and do well and thrive, if you will. In many ways, I learned this by watching one of my heroes. As a young man, I watched my father go through this really significant health crisis, and it just turned his world upside down. He was in his early 50s, and so many of the hopes and dreams that he held for himself, and so many of the things that he wanted to do were just turned on their heads, and some of those were just ripped away from him. And as a young man on the sideline looking at him, I observed the way that over time he climbed out from the weight of all of those things and began to reinvent himself and began to change and began to grow and began to live out of himself rather than his circumstances. And I determined then, even though I lacked the vocabulary for it, I determined then that I wanted to become like that myself. I wanted to become the type of person that would not be overwhelmed by circumstance and the things that life has to throw at me, that when curveballs come, and they do come, and you know it and I know it, that I'm going to be able to deal with it in ways that are going to help me go from strength to strength and not overwhelm me. And we call that resilience. I didn't know it at the time, but that's what resilience is. And from my observation, I don't think there's one size fits all. I don't think there's a formula for building resilience into our lives. It's going to look different for different people, depending upon circumstance, age, the way that God's wired you, and all those sorts of things. But I do think there are some fundamental things that we can adapt to or adopt, I guess, to help create the right attitude that's necessary to be more resilient. I think resilience involves both attitude and some behaviors, but there's certainly some key attitudes that we have to build into our lives to be resilient. And there's no particular order, but I want to start with this whole concept of hope or a perspective or an outlook on life that is not tied to your circumstances. I think if we're going to be resilient, we've got to have a sense of hope and perspective that is greater than circumstance, because if it's tied to our circumstance, then when our circumstances change, our sense of hope and optimism takes a hit as well. So if you're going to be resilient, that sense of optimism and hope has got to be tied to something greater than that, something external, if I could use that word. For me as a Christian, it's tied to the cross. For me, the cross is God's most personal and most powerful word to me possible. The cross is God's word to me that my life counts, that my life matters, that my life has value, that no matter who I am and what I've done, that he loves me and he cares for me. Those are all tied up in the cross and what Jesus did there for me as he did it for you as well. But what that means for me is that when circumstances arise in my life that have the potential to overwhelm me, uh, it reminds me that God hasn't brought me this far to abandon me. The cross is is my anchor, and I remember that, if God did all that for me, then He hasn't brought me this far now to turn His back on me. And so it gives me that sense of hope, that perspective that allows me to be resilient. It causes me to remember things like, for example, in Philippians chapter 1, verse 6, I think it is, where Paul talks about how the work that God has begun in us, He will see through to completion. These are the sorts of things that for me, that give me a sense of hope and a perspective and an outlook that's not tied to circumstance, that allows me to become resilient. And another thing is to recognize that the circumstances that you're facing are no reflection on you. The circumstances that come into your life are not a reflection on you. Life happens. People die. Viruses sweep through nations, wars happen. All of these things, they are beyond us in many ways. But so often what happens is that many of us, because we don't stand back and recognize that, or separate our circumstances from ourselves, what happens is we internalize these things. And when we internalize them, we tend to internalize them negatively. So, for example, there's a downturn in the economy, and it's going to affect our lives. There's no question of that. But when we internalize that, we begin to think, well, if only I'd done this, and if only I'd done that, and I should have. And we begin to approach it very negatively, and we end up beating ourselves up. And that just adds to that downward spiral, that sense of being overwhelmed. And so you need to separate yourself out from that. You need to recognize that circumstances are no reflection on you, but your response to them are. You have no control over most of what happens outside of you. You've got no control over most of the circumstances of your life. But you have all control over how you respond to them. And how you respond to them, how you determine in advance how you're going to respond, is going to determine whether you have resilience or not, whether you're going to be overwhelmed, or whether or not you're going to thrive through them. And this is tied to that sense of hope and perspective and everything else. They're all tied together. It's a package deal, but hopefully that sort of makes sense. Another one is, how would I put this, that I think you have to develop healthy thought processes in order to separate out your circumstances from yourself, to process them in creative and helpful ways. You've got to have really good thought processes, and I think most of us don't. I think most of us don't have healthy thought processes. But by that I mean this. I think most of us, our thought processes by default are driven by our feelings and our emotions more than we recognize. And it's not a healthy place to be. You see, if you haven't worked this out already, you need to know that your emotions are not facts. You don't have to act on your emotions. Your emotions are just raw data that has yet to be processed. All they're doing is telling you something. They're telling you that this hurts. They're telling you that you're anxious. They're telling you that this is unsettling. How you process that is entirely up to you. And to process it in a healthy way, you need to develop good thought processes. For me, again, this is where faith really has a huge impact to play in my life, and hopefully yours. Paul talks in Romans chapter 12 about how we're to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. In other words, we've got to develop healthy ways of seeing life, seeing ourselves, processing our emotions, so that we actually don't let them shape our response, but we take control. And this is all part and parcel of what I mean, of what I think it means to be resilient, to act intentionally, to live intentionally in response to things, and not be driven by emotions. I mean, that's one of the things that I learned powerfully by watching my father. I really admired the way that even though it was a struggle for him at times, that he changed his thought processes to process emotions in a different way, in a constructive way that allowed him to overcome things. And it's certainly been a big thing in my life as well, to say, this may feel like this, but, and it allows me to be resilient. And I think it's really important for us to do that. If we can change the way that we think, we'll begin to see hope and opportunity where we didn't see it before. And lastly, there's this whole thing of self-care that I think is important. There's a lot of things, but this is something I think is important. I think in times of crises, I think in times of change, I think in times of trauma and all of those sorts of things, I think it's really important that we become more intentional than ever about self-care. I know many of you in this time of lockdown are looking after yourself physically, and many of you are looking after yourself spiritually, and I commend you for it, and I'm so encouraged by that. But I think you also need to attend to yourself and look after yourself emotionally. I think so often this is the last area that we look at in our lives, and we pay a big price for it. I think that to be resilient is to be emotionally healthy, to be emotionally strong, and that takes intentionality. It takes effort. If you're one of these people who's always giving out and always trying to help others and always looking after people and encouraging them and helping pick them up when they're struggling, that's going to drain your emotional tank. And unless you consciously and intentionally fill it again, there's going to be nothing left for you. I think it's important you do that. And if you're one of these Christians that thinks, it's my spiritual thing, God will take care of it, I want to suggest you go back and reread Psalm 23. Psalm 23 is really about David's struggle with himself, this whole issue of resilience, and he's threatened to be overwhelmed by life and circumstances, and he's been enduring, and God brings him out from endurance to resilience. And I think we see it in Psalm 23 where he describes his life like going through a valley of a shadow of death, but then he goes through this attitude change. And he begins to engage emotionally. He takes care of, he acknowledges his emotional needs before God and lets God begin to speak into those, and it changes his perspective. And as a consequence, it gives him what he needs to get up off his knees and to triumph through circumstances and move into the season that God has waiting for him on the other side. And I think it's the same for you and me. We need to attend to ourselves. Good self-care involves emotional care as well. And so those are some of the things that I've worked intentionally to build into my life to help me become resilient. I hope it was helpful for you. If you've got any questions or any thoughts, feel free just to post them in the comments or get in contact with me. I'd love to have that conversation. In the meantime, God bless you. Until next time, take care.